Good evening, afternoon or morning. Movie Cat is at the microphone and today I will tell you about the crime comedy, The Whole 9 Yards. Nicholas Ozransky, whom his friends call Oz, once had a business in Chicago with his father-in-law, his own dental office, but one day his father-in-law borrowed a lot of money from creditors and lost it in Las Vegas, and then the father-in-law found a good way out of the situation, to commit suicide. Then Oz was forced to move to Montreal and start paying off his creditors little by little. His wife and mother-in-law are very unpleasant women. They hate him, point out that he earns not so much and often wish him death. As a result, Oz has got a depression and a personality crisis. Only a young cheerful assistant Jill asks him not to despair and tries to cheer him up. One day, a man named Jimmy Jones moves into the house next door. During the conversation, Oz notices his neighbor has a tulip tattoo on his forearm. Oz recalls with horror the high-profile Chicago case of hitman Jimmy Tulip Tedeschi. Jimmy was so nicknamed by the press because of his habit of sending a bouquet of his favorite flowers, tulips, to the graves of his victims. Earlier, Jimmy was the main fighter of Laszlo Gogolek, the leader of a large Hungarian group of the Chicago mafia, but Jimmy made a deal with the police, surrendering his boss in exchange for 5 years in prison. For this, Laszlo's son, Yanni, announced a hunt for Jimmy, but Jimmy refused the witness protection program and simply left the United States. The next day, Jimmy asks Oz to give him a tour of the neighborhood. Oz carefully pretends he doesn't know anything about Jimmy the Tulip. Yes, he lived in Chicago, but he knows absolutely nothing about local affairs. Jimmy turns out to be a charming guy who listens to Oz's complaints about a hard life and a terrible marriage. Finally, with a serious face, Jimmy advises Oz to order his wife to some hitman. Back at home, Oz tells his wife Sophia that their neighbor is Jimmy the Tulip. Pretty Sophia sends Oz to Chicago because hopes that current mafia leader Yanni Gogolek can pay them if they tell him where to find Jimmy. She sets a condition: if he betrays Jimmy, she will give him a divorce. If not, she will make Oz's life even worse. Oz calls his assistant and asks her to cancel the patients for the next few days because he has a business trip to Chicago. Jill advises him to have sex there with someone. Oz travels to Chicago to tell Yanni where Jimmy the Tulip is, while his wife tries to hire Jimmy to kill Oz, who is insured very good. In Chicago, Oz certainly doesn't expect to find the Hungarian mafia's address in a phone book, so he first goes to lunch with an old friend, Chicago Tribune reporter. Later, returning to the hotel, in his room, Oz finds a hefty guy, Frankie Fix, a fighter of the Gogolek gang. Frankie Fix is somehow convinced that Oz knows where Jimmy the Tulip is. Frankie Fix takes Oz to Yanni, where the gangster promises a commission for the location information of the traitor. Among the mafia guys, Oz sees a very beautiful woman. Her name is Cynthia and she is Jimmy Tulip's wife. When Oz promises to show where Jimmy lives, he is allowed to go back to the hotel. There, Oz realizes he made a terrible mistake and calls Jimmy to warn mafia coming for him. For some reason, Jimmy is absolutely not surprised by such news and reassures Oz on the phone. Jimmy says Oz did everything right and there is nothing to worry about. Suddenly, Cynthia knocks on Oz's room. Over a bottle of whiskey, she reveals that Jimmy was a bad husband and often cheated on her, but being a devout Catholic, he rejects the idea of a divorce. A few years ago, in order to hide $10 million from the authorities, Laszlo Gogolek sent it to Jimmy and Cynthia as a wedding gift. But the money can only be withdrawn if there are 3 signatures: Jimmy's, Cynthia's and Yanni's. If there are no 3 signatures, then 2 signatures and 1 death certificate will be acceptable, or 1 signature and 2 death certificates. It turns out that whoever comes out the winner, Yanni or Jimmy, he will kill Cynthia anyway to take the money. Oz feels he has fallen in love with Cynthia, so he confidently says he won't let anyone kill her. Later, they have sex. The next day, Frankie Fix takes Oz to Montreal and, in order not to let him go home, rents a hotel room. Jimmy is already waiting in the room for both of them. Frankie Fix is not very surprised. He laughs and gives Jimmy a friendly hug. Then all three of them go to have a dinner. The first thing Jimmy does at the cafe is promises to cut off the waiter's legs, set fire to his house and see how he gets out. And all because the waiter forgot the hamburger should not have a mayonnaise. Jimmy confesses to Oz that his wife tried to order him for $10,000 to kill Oz. Jimmy refused, of course, but he wasn't the first person she approached, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. Frankie Fix calls Yanni, tells him that he has found Jimmy and calls again to Montreal to lure him into a trap. Frankie and Jimmy plan to kill Gogolek, then Cynthia, and split the 10 million. Oz is driving to work and out of desperation, he tries to kill himself with a dose of laughing gas, but Jill stops him in time. Oz tells her that his wife ordered his death and that Jimmy the Tulip wants to make him an accomplice in the murders. The first thing alarmed Jill, but the second delighted her. She pulls Oz out of the office so he introduces her to a famous hitman. Also, the insightful Jill understands that Oz managed to sleep with someone in Chicago, as she advised him before. Right on Jimmy's doorstep, the girl admits she is a hitman beginner. Oz was her the first target. Jill got a job as Oz's assistant in order to get closer. But in 3 weeks she finds Oz is cute, plus she was imbued with sympathy for Oz, and in the end could not kill him. Jill knows a lot about guns and she is full of energy, so Jimmy invites her to assist on the elimination of Yanni Gogolek's gang tonight. When Frankie tells that Yanni is already on his way to the airport with Cynthia, Oz is nervous and he openly protests against Jimmy is killing his wife. Jimmy ignores the protest and only wonders how Oz still manages to believe in marriage. In the evening, Oz picks up Yanni, Cynthia and 2 gang fighters from the airport and takes them to his home, where they wait until the night for Jimmy to sleep. At this very moment, Oz's wife Sophie drives up to the house in the company of a new hitman who agreed to work for $12,500, originally for $15,000, but Sophie received a discount through sex. When the hitman notices Yanni and finds out that Jimmy Tulip is in the house, he immediately gets out of the car and directs himself to the house. At Jimmy's house, Yanni and his men sneak around. Suddenly, a naked Jill appears from the room. The guys freeze and Jimmy from behind kills them all in a second. A minute later, Jimmy kills Sophie's hitman, who has been sneaking outside. Having already dragged the hitman's body into the house, Frankie finds a Quebec police ID in his pocket. Meanwhile, Cynthia and Oz decide not to wait how the shootout ends. They get into the car and leave Oz's house at full speed. Jimmy is badly surprised by such an act and sends a pager call to Oz. On the phone, Oz confesses to Jimmy that he loves Cynthia, and Jill, in her turn, not thinking for a long time, adds that Cynthia is probably the same woman with whom Oz had sex in Chicago. Jimmy loses his temper and promises to find and kill both. But Jill takes the phone, giving him a few seconds to get some peace of mind. Oz learns that Jimmy accidentally killed a cop and comes up with a good plan to cover the tracks. As a favor in return, Jimmy must not kill Oz and Cynthia. After leaving Cynthia on the yacht of his patient, Oz asks her to run away if he doesn't come back or stops beeping by pager. Oz then heads to his dentist's office, where Jill, Frankie, Jimmy and a dead cop are already waiting for him. With sulfuric acid, Oz destroys the corpse's fingerprints. Oz then takes out some of Jimmy's teeth and inserts them into the corpse's mouth. After that, the killers douse Oz's car with gasoline and burn it along with all the bodies. The police must come to the conclusion that Jimmy Tedeschi and Yanni Gogolek were killed and burned by one of their numerous enemies. In the morning, when the detectives come to Oz's office, he plays the role of a simpleton who has loaned his car to his new neighbor Jimmy Jones. At the home of fake Jimmy Jones, the police find the bodies of Yanni's fighters and in the yard the car of their detective, in which he left a recorder with files of his negotiations with Sophie. She is arrested and blamed with attempted murder. The detectives assure Oz now he will have no difficulties with a divorce. Now when Yanni is done and Jimmy is legally dead, all that remains is to withdraw 10 million from the bank. Cynthia agrees to give them to Jimmy, and in return he will leave her and Oz alive. While Cynthia and Jill are at the bank, Jimmy takes Oz to the marina, where they and Frankie board a yacht. Jill tries to persuade Cynthia to appropriate all the money for herself in order to run away together, but Cynthia refuses, explaining that she has fallen in love with Oz in this short time and cannot allow Jimmy to kill him. Jill is glad that her provocation did not work, because she sincerely wishes Oz happiness in his personal relationships. After receiving a message the transaction is complete, Jimmy points his gun at Oz, but kills Frankie instead. He explains his act by saying that Frankie would have killed both of them, Oz as the last witness of the scam, and Jimmy for weakness. At the bank, Jill asks to transfer $1 million to a separate account. This is the future wedding present Jimmy makes for Oz and Cynthia. Meantime, Jimmy does not tell Oz about this. Oz meets at the airport Cynthia and proposes her. Jimmy the Tulip realizes that he fell in love with a young energetic Jill. Thank you for watching. Press hearts and subscribe. And what do you hate as much as Jimmy Mayonnaise? Write in the comments.